to Literacy Matters, Empowered Conversations. I'm your host, Dr. Cheryl Lundy Swift. Listeners, I cannot wait for you to learn from our esteemed guest, Zaretta Hammond. I have had the distinct pleasure to hear her speak, and I know you are going to learn a lot. You're going to leave inspired and empowered. Zaretta Hammond is a teacher educator and a national education consultant. She is the author of Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain, promoting authentic engagement and rigor for culturally and linguistically diverse students. Ms. Hammond is a former high school and community college writing instructor. And for the past 25 years, she has supported schools and other institutions in deepening their understanding of the integration of culturally responsive practices, the science of reading, and the science of learning. She is a strong, and I say strong, literacy advocate who sits on the advisory board for Core Learning, a reading advocacy and training organization, and is a former trustee at the Center for the Collaborative Classroom. Zaretta, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It is my pleasure. So I want to get into it with you, and I want to, first of all, ask you, when you think about culturally responsive pedagogy, I want to know, what is it and how can educators intentionally align the science of reading with culturally responsive pedagogy to either avoid that either or thinking that I know you talk about?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because I see teachers struggling with this. And first, let's define culturally responsive teaching. I think that's where we can begin to kind of stretch ourselves. A lot of times it's defined simply as kind of affirming students, building relationships, creating a sense of belonging by bringing elements of students' identities into the classroom. And all of that is absolutely important, but it is not all of what culturally responsive teaching is. One of the elements that Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings talked about as she coined the term and did her research around that was at the core was the notion of academic prowess, helping students build their learning power. And so in addition to that, comes critical consciousness. As students are able to take in information, as their competence and confidence grows, then they are able to have a greater sense of agency. So culturally responsive teaching really is a matter of braiding those together. I created the Ready for Rigor framework to help educators really understand it's your own awareness, how you understand the social political context, so that you're not replicating things that are reinforcing inequity. But just having awareness is not enough. You need that opportunity to build learning partnerships with your students, not just being friendly and having a good rapport, but literally building an alliance so that you and the student together are creating the energy, right? This pact to make progress in key areas. And the student is not going along for the ride. They are the driver of that. The teacher is the coach, is the personal trainer of students' cognitive development. Then there is building that community of learners, right? And so culturally responsive teaching is about that belonging, not just having morning meetings, but that students really feel like they belong to the culture of learning and the craftsmanship of learning that sits at the center of that community of learners. But it also means that in the sense of literacy is that they are pushing themselves to become literate and all that means. And then there's information processing. That is what is the engine of that push to become literate, that processing information, taking inert information, being able to move it through our brains, information processing systems, so that it's usable knowledge. And in this case, when we talk about literacy, that really means wiring the brain so that it is able to read, right? Code breaker, be a code breaker, be a meaning maker, text user, and then a text critic. We want students to jump to the comprehension without building these other foundational pillars. So culturally responsive teaching really is about those core things, and at the center is this growing agency that we're coaching the student through.
I love that. What you're doing is you're aligning, the science of learning and the science of reading together, which you do so beautifully. So when we think about supporting teachers, how can we move from simply teaching students to break the code to really helping them think with the text? And when I think about this question, I want you to really focus on those under-resourced students, right? Our special students with disabilities, our Black and Brown students who are multilingual. How can we move from teaching students to decode to really helping them think with text?
Yeah, I think this is so important, but recognizing it's not a straight line. This is why we're wiring the brain to read. That is not a natural state for humans. And I think this is something that doesn't get communicated to I actually had a teacher say, "What do you mean by that?" And I'm like, we're cued to walk. Just leave a baby alone, and around 10 months, it's going to start trying to pull up on every surface it can, right?
Yes.
Nail everything down. But that is not true for reading. You can be 80 years old, surrounded by print, and still not know what that says. And in my life, I've had grandparents and other people who would be considered illiterate, not because they weren't smart, but they did not know how to read. So learning to read, we know wiring that brain starts with understanding that the speech sounds we make get encoded in symbols and that you have to learn to match those letters to the symbol. That doesn't take forever. That should take, first grade, all of second grade, maybe a little review at the top of third grade. So we're not teaching phonics. That would, be what we call that forever. Right. We are just laying that foundation. But then we have to move to the next level, which is helping students understand how words work, right? Syllables, so they can decode big words, that syllables have meaning. That's morphology, right? Structured literacy is a big thing now, particularly when we start to think about students with unfinished learning at the middle school level. But to get to that comprehension where we're reading for understanding and to take in new information means that I have to have a level of automaticity with all those other things. I don't need to use any mental effort on them. And this is where the science of learning comes in.
Sure.
So to be able to get students to read and then comprehend, right? Because they are smart. They come in, their thinking comprehension is usually high. Thinking comprehension is what we're talking about, having a conversation. I don't need to read to actually share insightful opinion or understand facts. But if I'm reading and I don't know how to decode those words to translate them into speech sounds in my head, then I'm not going to be able to unlock the information that's in that text. So that's where we want students to be, and we want them to do that effortlessly. So the goal as they're moving from code breaker to meaning maker to text user is automaticity, and that's where the science of learning comes in. Here's the last thing I'll say about that, and I think educators really need to understand. All reading problems show up as a comprehension problem. And why do I mention that? Because what I see is we're now doubling down on comprehension strategies. But teachers are not being diagnosticians, meaning going back to say, what really is the nature of the problem? It looks like a comprehension problem, but is this really a, word wealth problem? I mean, your vocabulary is shallow. You don't really understand. Is it that you're having problems with the big words? What is it? So clearly there's not a level of automaticity with other areas that allow all cognitive resources to go to comprehension. So I think it's just another part of what we have to do. We don't need to just cover our content, but we need to look back at the learner to make sure that they are taking it in and that rewiring of the brain is actually happening.
To look back at the learner, that is really an important reminder for all of us, right? That's why we're doing this work, right?
That's right.
So you were talking about foundational learning and obviously thinking about comprehension as well. What instructional shifts are needed to bridge that foundational literacy with higher order comprehension and criticality?
Yeah, I think the primary thing is getting the student to really be the driver of their learning, right? So the fact is, and I'm going to go back to to automaticity. If the student isn't paying attention to how they're actually internalizing sound spelling correspondences so that within a few seconds they can see the symbol and know what sound to say, then they're going to continue to be slow, right? We want to keep going for the comprehension and the criticality. But if those other things aren't there, it's not going to happen. That said, we cannot delay the thinking comprehension. Students should always be invited into conversation. They should always be invited to think about that, because what's going to happen is when those two things come together, here's the thinking, growing my background knowledge, comes together with the skills for unlocking words on a page. Wow. That's where criticality is now going to move from being just a text user to a text critic. Now I can actually have agency. Now I can question, is this propaganda? That's the ultimate skill we want. But we sometimes try to get there too fast and neglect developing foundational automaticity versus I got to go over phonics for, 18 weeks. Like if we're doing it right, we don't have to do phonics for 18 weeks.
So very, very true. You know what? It's interesting. I used to say to some of my teachers, we're teachers, we're not coverers of, we're not. We teach things, we don't cover things. And so that's something that's important. Now you mentioned this kind of quickness to get through the curriculum without looking back at the learner. That makes me think about productive struggle. And you have said that productive struggle is that sweet spot for learning. How can teachers know when students are truly struggling productively versus just being frustrated or overwhelmed?
This is such a great question. And it is a great question because what it means is teachers have to take time to understand the science of learning. So what that means is if I need to get students into the learning pit, James Nottingham talks about the zone of proximal development as a learning pit. A lot of teachers think, oh, who wants to get in a pit? And they build a little bridge over. And as a result, the teacher's carrying the majority of the cognitive load and the student gets very scared and hesitant to get into the pit. The reality is that is where our dendrites grow, right? When we understand the science of learning, we understand that we learn things through that push and pull effort.
Yeah.
And that push and pull effort is very much like weightlifting to a muscle. That the more you progressively lift a heavier weight, you in essence are tearing down the muscle, but its response is to come back stronger.
Yeah.
So this is the same exact process that happens with brain growth. There are dendrites that start to fold over. It's why we have the wrinkles in our brain. Those dendrites grow to such massive level that they bundle together and they become neural pathways. And the neural pathway in literacy we're trying to develop is this reading neural pathway. This is how you learn to read, right? You see the symbol, you say the sound, you can unlock the word. That is the rewiring process. So when we're in a cover mode, we think it's magic. Well, I covered that. It does not mean the student has rewired their brain. There's an active part to productive struggle. So we want the student to get in the pit. The difference is, are they struggling productively or destructively? And the way we know the difference is, there's times when we work on something and it's hard and it makes our brain kind of bendy and, my brain hurts from doing that. But it's a good pain, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, can we do that again? And what's happening is at that sweet spot of care and push, the students get a dopamine hit. And dopamine is the stickiest thing in our brain. And it, it allows us to go further to want to do that again, right? Because we've gotten this kind of pleasurable reward at the end of doing hard things. So we're actually wired to do hard things. And the productive part is that we're seeing slow, steady progress. This is our brain's progress principle. So the way that you can tell is students are maybe making a 1% effort to stretch themselves, but there's some type of positive hum right? Kids are working on something, right? You might hear laughter in the classroom, right? You should not see students just stopping, right? So the look fors to know, is it productive or is it destructive? Are students in their zone of frustration versus their zone of development? Is their emotional response, right? As the student just sits there and looks at the teacher thinking you're going to come and do it, and if you've over scaffolded, then you're going to come rescue them, right? Or the student is waiting for you to give more information or tell them, is this right before I proceed? That's frustration, but it looks like, hey, I'm just asking for help here, right? So again, teachers really need to understand and have a sense of what those look fors are when students are in their zone of frustration.
Yeah. You just said that, and it actually, I got goosebumps, because basically what you're saying is that learning is an emotional process.
It is.
And we can't take it out of the process.
This is something I say all the time, that we need to not just think about, and this is another thing I think people get wrong about culturally responsive teaching. It is correct to associate it with belonging, social emotional development, that sort of thing. But we have a tendency to put that in relationships and morning meetings, when the most important place that should be is next to cognition. So in the learning episode, have we helped the student develop their own self-awareness? This is where metacognition comes in. Metacognition is not just thinking about your thinking, but it's an awareness of what am I doing when I'm in the process of learning. When the student starts to feel their body responding in a way, they should know, I need to get myself back in the zone of development because I'm now in my zone of frustration. The teacher should be able to read some signs. And if they know that student, this is that relationship piece, that partnership piece, they know the student, and they can see the student, you're starting to venture into this frustration. Here's the small thing I can say to you to get you to bring yourself back to center, to stay in that sweet spot. So we need to reimagine and rethink about emotion close to cognitive activity, learning episodes.
Wow. So what exactly does a culturally responsive classroom look like when students are being pushed into that zone of proximal development? I see teachers not really understanding exactly what to do. Talk about this balance of care and push.
Yeah, I think the challenge is culturally responsive teaching when you walk into a classroom is not something you are going to see on the surface. And so this is kind of the, for lack of a better word, kind of the delusion that we've kind of led ourselves with, the rigor walks and the equity walk, that I can walk into a classroom and in 5 minutes or less, I can say it's culturally responsive or the students are engaged. We call these poor proxies. Like, there's a body of research that says you cannot look at a student and know whether cognitive activity is always happening.
Right.
And engagement is a poor proxy for, is the brain actually engaged in that kind of what I call chewing, right? The mixing of here's what I do know with here's the new stuff. And right, that's what's happening in productive struggle. The student is accessing their funds of knowledge. They are integrating the new content into that, and they're chewing, right? They're working. That's the productive part, the back and forth. So a culturally responsive classroom may not have posters that are on the walls. It may or may not have books that are diverse, or it should, but that is not the determining factor. The determining factor is, are students able to use all their resources, their cultural knowledge, their background knowledge, their linguistic repertoires, in the service of this productive struggle? And is it set up in a way that is congruent with how learning happens in their community? Is there time to talk? Is there time to pull things apart and put them together? Versus I'm just sitting at the desk listening to the teacher, and then I'm reading the little, book in a group. And right, is there a pedagogy of compliance where it's really highly managed? Who gets to talk when? Turn, do this now, right? That compliance that we now are socializing students in. So a culturally responsive classroom could have a lot of configurations. The hallmarks are the students are building agency. The students are able to use their resources. The things that in kind of a Eurocentric view, be quiet, look forward, that we might think of as good classroom management might be reconfigured to actually have more time for students talking, students doing parallel work together. And that doesn't have to be all the time, but that's the way the time in the classroom is divided, right?
Yeah.
There's an
Yeah.
opportunity to do that where students don't have to feel like the main thing for me to do is sit and be quiet.
Yes, that there is nothing worse than to go into a silent classroom. What is happening?
What's happening?
The
There is
person,
no learning happening.
none.
You might get a gold star for a good classroom, but learning is not happening. So you can depend, because again, only the learner learns. And what does that mean? Students have to be active.
Yeah.
They have to be processing that information.
Yes.
Talking is how we process coming out of collectivist cultures. They have to be using something in the third space, meaning manipulatives with their hand that help before they've internalized those sound spelling correspondence or other things, right? And that there is active space for that. And I'm just not talking about literacy stations. Like there are teachers that are going to hear this and like, I already do that. Listen, if 100% of your students are not already knocking it out of the park, reading on grade level or above grade level, you need to go back and check what you're doing. Because just because I do that doesn't mean the learner's learning that.
Woo, that is powerful and so, so true. The person doing the talking is the person doing the learning. The person doing the writing is the person doing the learning. The person doing the reading is the person doing the learning. And I love that you were asking them to go back and check it, because if 100%.
That's right. And I would say that it's hard. It's hard for teachers. Teaching is fast and furious, right? Yes. And to step back, this is why going into it, beginning of a school year, teachers really need to set up, how will I get a little sample of my teaching so I can actually review that? I always encourage them, get your iPhone out. Mm-hmm. You don't have to record students, but if you want to record, you can record. But just open the audio and leave it there for 10 minutes and listen to who's talking.
Yes.
Right? Listen to what's happening. And because we're in it, we cannot see that. You can videotape the first 5-10 minutes of class. How are you helping students get into their zone of proximal development? Or are you executing a pedagogy of compliance? Because it's about sit down, do the do now. Let's take, now, okay, we've just shut down any part of creative cognition that we want to leverage to help students do rewiring, right? Nobody goes to the gym in the middle of a busy, downtown street. Why? It's just too much going on. We're in a gym. Gym has equipment for that, right? We start off that. So there's so much opportunity for teachers to rethink their practice. And to me, that's what I would see in a culturally responsive classroom. The teacher is responsive to who the students are. Yes. And the content, the curriculum is relevant. So it leverages, it creates little stepping stones for them to bring in the new content and mix it together through their information processing systems.
You're so inspiring. You made me think about one of the very first times I had the pleasure of going into a classroom to observe a teacher. And I'd had a little meeting beforehand to say, what are you struggling with? And she said, there's a student that I just don't think likes me. And I can't figure out how to get to them. They won't do any work and they don't really participate in class. So I said, okay, I'll come in and I'll see what I see. And I went in, all I didn't write any notes. I just marked her pattern of where she walked and who she talked to and who she looked at. And she kept her back to that student for the most of the session. And there were times that he was trying to engage and she just didn't notice him. And so when I showed her the path, she just burst into tears because she was like, I didn't realize I was doing that. So that's, again, going back to see your practice. And she didn't. Right. She was unaware, but she also had some issues with that student, so she just didn't engage him.
And here's the thing about it. It is why it's so important to have instructional coaches and have a good relationship with them because you want to be able to tell them the truth. We are looking for magic bullets. What's the new curriculum? What's the strategy? As if the magic is in that. It's, Harry Potter's Wizarding World, and that's a wand. That is not what literacy practices are, because I have teachers ask me that all the time. What's a literacy practice that would be culturally responsive?
Sure.
First, you got to know who your students are.
Yeah.
Then you have to understand their schema. Then you have to say, how does this new information connect? How can I help them find the connections so it pulls them forward, pulls them into it, not just as a motivational issue, but because it starts to move them toward grasping a concept. I have this scale I developed. I write about it in my newest book that'll be coming out. And the scale is like 1 to 5. How well does a student grasp the concept? And for students that are dependent learners, they don't even understand they're not grasping. They're just going through the motions. You told me to do this worksheet. I'm going to do the worksheet. There's a compliance element versus being metacognitive. Pay attention to, are you understanding? Are you grasping this, right? That's a different responsibility for students.
Yeah.
And a lot of students are like, whoa, you want me to do that cognitive work? Yes, let's start there.
Yeah.
What you described about that teacher is where we all can use kind of these simple inquiry tools, tiny experiments, observations, and then to be open to listening to what that data is going to tell me, and being willing to then shift my practice and do that as a tiny experiment. What would it look like for the next 14 days for me to change the pattern? Where I actually position myself, where I actually call that student by name into the conversation, not as a cold call, but it's like, I see you're excited about that. Even before they have to raise their hand, like you can read their face, like you can see them leaning in. Like, what's your opinion about that? So that student starts to feel part of not just the community of the classroom, but the community of the learners. Me and my learning, how I learn, talking about learning to read is important, and people are listening, and I can kind of contribute to the whole, everyone else being learners and getting better together.
Join us next time as we dive deeper into how we can build a thriving community of learners with insight and inspiration from Zaretta Hammond.